In a world gilded with immense wealth and power, where a woman's worth was measured by the glitter of her jewels and the pedigree of her name, one young woman dared to appear with neither. She was a ghost at the feast, a forgotten name, in a tattered gown armed only with a promise made to a dying father. They saw her as an object of pity, a target for their cruel amusement. But they were blind. They couldn't see the fire in her eyes, nor could they comprehend the secret history that tied her to the most powerful and coldest man in the room. What happens when the one man everyone fears decides to champion, the one woman everyone scorns? The grand ballroom of Harrington House was a galaxy of man-made stars. 1,000 candles suspended in 3 colossal chandeliers of Venetian crystal dripped golden light onto the polished marble floor below. The light caught on the diamond tiaras of dowagers, the ruby clasps of debutantes, and the polished signet rings of lords whose lineages stretched back to the Norman conquest. A symphony of scents, expensive French perfume beeswax, and the faint, intoxicating aroma of champagne mingled with the soaring notes of a waltz played by an orchestra hidden behind a screen of potted palms. Into this dazzling universe stepped Amelia Vance. She felt less like a guest and more like an intruder from a forgotten, dustier world. Her invitation, a heavy cream card embossed with the Harrington crest, was authentic. It had been secured by her late mother's last remaining friend, a kindly but peripheral figure in society, who hoped with a tragic sort of optimism that one magical night could reverse a decade of misfortune. Amelia's gown was the source of her profound anxiety, a physical manifestation of her family's fall. It had been her mother's a creation of sea-foam green silk from a time when the Vance name meant something. But that was a lifetime ago. Now the silk was faded, the vibrant green softened to a pale, ghostly mint. The delicate silver embroidery along the bodice was tarnished, and several seed pearls had been lost to time, leaving tiny vacant holes. Amelia had spent a week meticulously mending a small tear near the hem, her stitches, so fine they were nearly invisible, but she knew they were there. To her the gown screamed of poverty, of making do, of a desperation that had no place in this opulent arena. She clutched her worn reticule, its silk frayed at the corners, and kept her shoulders back, a posture drilled into her by a governess in a happier past. You are a Vance. We do not slouch, Amelia. We face the world head-on, no matter its disposition. Her father's words, spoken from his sickbed, echoed in her mind. It was a promise to him that had brought her here tonight. Not to find a husband, as most of the other young women were, but to seek an audience, however brief, with Lord Harrington. He was a man known for his investments in burgeoning artists, and Amelia's last hope rested in the portfolio of sketches tucked away in her small rented room. If she could just sell one, it would be enough for another month's rent for medicine for her ailing aunt. Her entrance did not go unnoticed. A ripple of whispers followed her as she moved hesitantly along the perimeter of the ballroom. She was a moth that had blundered into a conservatory of exotic butterflies, her muted colors a stark and unwelcome contrast to their vibrant splendor. "Good heavens, Beatrice, look at that!" hissed a voice laced with venom. Amelia didn't need to turn to know who it was. Lady Beatrice Cavendish, daughter of the Earl of Pembroke, was the undisputed queen of this social circle. She was stunningly beautiful, with hair the color of spun gold and eyes of piercing sapphire blue. But her beauty was a gilded cage for a cruel and shallow spirit. "I see it, Penelope, but I scarcely believe it," Beatrice replied, her voice carrying with deliberate clarity. "Is that a dress or a drapery pulled from a haunted house?" Their coterie of admirers tittered the sound sharp and brittle as breaking glass. Amelia's cheeks burned with a heat that was almost painful. She focused her gaze on a large, ornate tapestry depicting a hunting scene, pretending to be absorbed by its artistry, praying they would lose interest. But Beatrice was like a hawk that had spotted a field mouse. She was not one to abandon the hunt so easily. She and her friends Penelope and Gwendolen glided over their silk gowns, rustling like the approach of a serpent. "I don't believe we've been introduced," Beatrice began, her smile a perfect predatory curve. "But then one doesn't often see your sort at Lord Harrington's annual ball." The emphasis on "your sort" was a calculated insult. Amelia forced herself to meet the icy blue gaze. "Amelia Vance," she said, her voice quieter than she intended, but steady. "Vance." Beatrice tapped a silk-gloved finger to her chin in mock contemplation. "Ah, yes. The name has a familiar ring. Shipping, wasn't it? My father mentioned them. A rather spectacular failure, if I recall." The barb struck its target, piercing through Amelia's carefully constructed composure. The spectacular failure had been her father's life's work, a fleet of ships, and a network of trade routes lost to a single catastrophic investment. It wasn't just a business that had collapsed. It was her father's very soul. The ruin had taken his health, his spirit, and finally his life. My father was an honorable man. Amelia said, her voice now laced with a cold fire that surprised even herself. Honorable, perhaps, but hardly successful. Gwendolen chimed in, eager to please her queen. "Success, my dear, is what gets you a new gown for the season." Beatrice's eyes raked over Amelia's dress, from the tarnished embroidery to the meticulously repaired hem. "Tell me, Miss Vance," she purred, leaning in conspiratorially, "did you pull that from your grandmother's crypt? It has that aged look about it." The laughter that followed was unrestrained, drawing the attention of several nearby couples. People were turning to stare their faces, a mixture of amusement and pity. Amelia felt trapped, pinned by the weight of their judgment. She wanted nothing more than to flee, to run back to the anonymity of her small room. But the image of her father's tired, hopeful face flashed in her mind. "Face the world head-on, Amelia." She took a slow, deliberate breath. "On the contrary, Lady Beatrice," she replied, her voice clear and carrying in the momentary lull. "This was my mother's, and I find it infinitely more valuable to wear something that was loved by someone of character than to wear something new that is merely paid for by someone of title." A collective, sharp intake of breath came from the small crowd that had gathered. Beatrice's perfect smile faltered her sapphire eyes, flashing with genuine anger. No one spoke to her that way. No one dared. She had been publicly challenged by a nobody in a tattered dress. For a moment, the moth had shown the glint of a steel needle. The air crackled with tension, and across the vast, glittering expanse of the ballroom, a pair of cold, watchful eyes took notice. In an alcove near the grand French windows that overlooked the manicured gardens, Duke Alaric Beaumont stood as a figure apart. He was a man carved from winter itself, tall and broad-shouldered, with hair as black as a starless night, and eyes the color of grey, frozen sea. At 32, he was the master of one of the oldest and wealthiest duchies in England, a man whose power was absolute and whose presence commanded a suffocating degree of reverence. And he was utterly, profoundly bored. He held a glass of brandy, its amber liquid untouched, using it as a prop to ward off the endless parade of hopeful mothers and their simpering daughters. They saw his title, his fortune, his imposing, handsome looks, but they failed to see the formidable walls he had erected around himself. They called him the coldest duke, a title he had earned and did nothing to discourage. Warmth, he had learned long ago, was a vulnerability, Emotion was a weapon that others could and would wield against you. His reputation was born from tragedy. 5 years prior, he had been engaged to Lady Isabel, a woman he had loved with a fierce, all-consuming passion. 2 weeks before their wedding, she had eloped with his own cousin, taking with her a significant portion of her dowry, which she had already managed to secure. The betrayal was not just emotional, it was a public humiliation of the highest order. It had shattered Alaric's faith in love, in loyalty, in the very fabric of the society he was meant to lead. He had retreated into himself, becoming a man of few words and even fewer smiles, his heart encased in a fortress of ice. From his vantage point, he surveyed the ballroom with a cynical, weary gaze. He saw the same people wearing different clothes, engaging in the same tired rituals of courtship and commerce. It was a marketplace of flesh and titles, a performance of practiced graces and hidden agendas. He recognized every calculated smile, every feigned compliment. He saw Lady Beatrice Cavendish holding court her beauty, a dazzling but empty spectacle. He had danced with her once a year ago, and found her conversation to be a tedious litany of gossip and self-praise. His eyes drifted, scanning the crowd, and then they stopped. He saw her, a young woman standing alone, her dress a pale, washed-out green, amidst the jewel-toned silks. She was out of place so obviously, so that it was almost painful to watch. He saw the whispers that followed her, the pointed fingers and mocking glances. It was the predictable cruelty of the pack turning on the one who was different. He was about to dismiss it as another banal bit of society drama when he saw Beatrice and her sycophants descend. Alaric was too far away to hear the words, but he was an expert in reading the silent language of power and humiliation. He saw Beatrice's smug, condescending posture, the cruel curve of her lips. He saw the way her friends preened, basking in her reflected malice. And he saw the young woman in green, Amelia Vance, absorb the verbal blows. He watched her back stiffen her chin lift. He saw the fire ignite in her expression, a sudden brilliant spark of defiance in the face of overwhelming scorn. He saw her speak, and though her words were lost to the music, their effect was not. He saw the shock on Beatrice's face, the sudden halt of the sycophant's giggles. The small crowd that had gathered to watch the kill was now staring at this unknown woman with a newfound grudging respect. It was a remarkable display of courage. In this world of bowing and scraping, of placating the powerful, she had stood her ground. She had not shouted or wept. She had delivered her retort with the cool precision of a duelist's blade. Something stirred within Alaric, a feeling so foreign he almost didn't recognize it. Interest. Genuine, unadulterated interest. This woman was not like the others. She possessed a quiet strength, a dignity that her worn dress could not diminish. In fact, the dress juxtaposed with her bearing only served to amplify it. She was not defined by the silk she wore, but by the steel in her spine. Then the name whispered by a nearby gossiping lord reached him. Vance. Thomas Vance's girl, I believe. Poor fellow lost everything. Vance. The name struck Alaric like a physical blow. The fortress of ice around his heart cracked. Suddenly this was no longer a detached observation. It was personal. Thomas Vance, the brilliant kind and tragically trusting man who had been his own father's business partner, the man whose ruin was a dark, unspoken chapter in the Beaumont family history, a secret weight of guilt that Alaric had carried since his father's deathbed confession. The late Duke, a powerful but sometimes reckless man, had convinced Vance to invest his entire fortune in a new shipping venture to the Americas. But the venture was sabotaged by a rival, a man named Lord Percival Finch, who fed both men false information. The Beaumont duchy was vast enough to absorb the catastrophic losses. The Vances were not. They were destroyed. His father, consumed by guilt and pride, had never been able to face Vance, to admit his folly and offer restitution. He had died of a heart attack weeks later, leaving Alaric with the burden of the truth and a whispered, desperate plea: "Find Vance. Make it right." But the Vances had disappeared. They had sold their London home, settled their debts, and vanished from society, swallowed by the obscurity that awaits the fallen. Alaric had searched, employing private agents, but they had found nothing. And now here she was, Thomas Vance's daughter, standing in the heart of the world that had cast her family out, wearing her poverty like a shield and her dignity like a crown. The music swelled, signaling the start of a new waltz. Alaric watched as several young bucks, emboldened by the drama, began to approach Beatrice, no doubt, to offer their sympathies and curry her favour. Amelia Vance stood alone, once again, an island in the swirling sea of society, the brief glow of her defiance fading, leaving her looking fragile and terribly isolated. The coldest duke pushed himself away from the wall. The brandy glass was placed on a passing servant's tray. His movements were deliberate, imbued with a sudden, unshakable purpose. The boredom had evaporated, replaced by a potent cocktail of guilt, responsibility, and a strange protective admiration. He was going to make it right, and he was going to start now. The aftermath of Amelia's retort was a heavy, ringing silence. Beatrice's face a moment ago, a mask of amused contempt, was now a canvas of pure fury. The flush that rose up her neck was not one of maidenly embarrassment, but of incandescent rage. To be bested, and so publicly by a penniless nobody, was an insult of the highest magnitude. The crowd around them, sensing the shift in power, held its breath, waiting for the Queen Bee's retaliatory strike. Character. Beatrice finally spat, her voice low and dangerous. You speak of character when you sneak into a ball to which you clearly do not belong, dressed in rags. Your presence here is an insult to our hosts, Lord and Lady Harrington. You are nothing but a common little social climber, and a clumsy one at that. I have an invitation, Amelia stated simply, her hand tightening on her reticule, where the precious card was safely tucked. She refused to be cowed. And my father taught me that a person's station in life does not define their worth. It is a lesson some are perhaps never taught. The second blow landed with even greater force. It was a direct critique not just of Beatrice, but of her entire worldview. Gwendolen and Penelope gasped, looking at Beatrice as if expecting her to command the very walls to swallow Amelia whole. Before Beatrice could unleash the torrent of venom gathering behind her eyes, a new figure intervened. Lord Percival Finch, a man whose tailored waistcoats were as loud as his opinions, stepped forward. He was a known associate of Beatrice's father, and a man whose smile never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. Alaric from across the room recognized him instantly. He was the very man his father had named as the third party, the architect of the Vances' ruin. Seeing him approach Amelia now sent a chill down the Duke's spine. "Come now, Lady Beatrice," Finch said, with an oily paternalism, placing a hand on her arm. "There is no need to trouble yourself with such insignificance." He turned his gaze upon Amelia, a dismissive sneer playing on his lips. "Miss Vance is it I knew your father? A dreamer. Flew too close to the sun, I'm afraid. It seems the fall was a long one." The casual, pitying cruelty of his words was worse than Beatrice's open hostility. He spoke of her father's destruction as if it were a predictable fable, a simple matter of overambition. Amelia felt a wave of nausea. This man, with his smug pronouncements, was trampling on the memory of the kindest, most brilliant man she had ever known. My father was a visionary. Amelia countered her voice, trembling slightly but filled with conviction. He believed in progress, in building things. He was betrayed by those who only believe in taking. Finch's smile tightened. For a fraction of a second, his mask slipped, and a flicker of something unease anger flashed in his eyes. Visionaries often end up in paupers' graves, he said coolly. You would do well to remember your place. This world has no room for the Vances anymore. Perhaps the servants' entrance would be more to your comfort. This was the final devastating blow. It was an outright command to leave an erasure of her right to even occupy the same space. The surrounding guests, who might have felt a flicker of sympathy for Amelia, now backed away. To be associated with her was to stand against Lady Beatrice and Lord Finch, a social suicide they were not prepared to commit. The circle of empty space around Amelia widened. She was utterly alone, the full crushing weight of her family's disgrace settling upon her. Tears pricked at the back of her eyes, hot and shameful. She had promised her father she would be strong, but this was a relentless, multi-pronged assault. The orchestra, oblivious to the high drama unfolding on the ballroom floor, struck the opening chords of a new waltz. The vibrant, joyful music was a mocking counterpoint to Amelia's desolation. Couples began to move towards the center of the floor. The moment was breaking. Soon she would be forgotten, a brief and distasteful interruption to the evening's festivities. Beatrice, sensing victory, gave a final triumphant smirk. Her point had been made. The moth was about to be swept out with the dust. Amelia's shoulders sagged. She had failed. She would have to leave her one chance to speak with Lord Harrington gone. The weight of it all, the rent her aunt's medicine, the gnawing hunger that was a near-constant companion, pressed down on her. She turned her movements stiff with defeat, preparing to make the long, lonely walk of shame towards the exit. But her path was blocked. A figure stood before her, so tall he seemed to eclipse the candlelight. He had moved with such silent, predatory grace that no one had seen him cross the vast floor. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers as they recognized the severe, handsome face and the imposing figure. Duke Alaric Beaumont, the coldest duke. He had not paused at Beatrice's side. He had not acknowledged Lord Finch. He had walked a straight, unwavering line from his alcove directly to Amelia. His grey eyes, which most people found so intimidating, were fixed on her face, and in their depths she saw not coldness, but an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. The air around them seemed to thin, the ambient chatter of the ballroom dying away to a stunned hush. The only sound was the soaring melody of the waltz. Beatrice stared, her mouth slightly agape. Lord Finch's smug expression dissolved into one of wary confusion. This was not possible. The Duke never involved himself in such petty squabbles. He rarely even danced. Alaric ignored them all. His entire world for that moment seemed to have narrowed to the young woman in the faded green dress whose eyes now shone with unshed tears, but also with that spark of defiance he had admired from across the room. He gave a slight formal bow, a gesture of profound respect that stunned the onlookers into utter silence, and then he spoke his voice, a deep, resonant baritone that cut through the music and carried to every corner of the silent room. "Miss Vance," he said, his gaze never leaving hers, "I believe they are playing our song. May I have this dance?" The world stopped. For a full 10 seconds, the only movement in the Harrington ballroom was the flickering of the candle flames. The orchestra played on, but it seemed a distant phantom sound. Every eye was locked on the tableau at the center of the room, the most powerful, unobtainable man in the kingdom, bowing before the most scorned and insignificant woman. Amelia could not breathe. His question hung in the air, a preposterous, impossible thing. Our song. The words made no sense. She had never met this man, never spoken to him. She knew of him only by reputation, a remote, untouchable figure, more myth than man. And yet here he was, his hand extended, his glacial grey eyes, holding a look she could not decipher. It wasn't pity, it was something else entirely. Something that felt like recognition. Beside her, Beatrice Cavendish looked as if she had been struck by lightning. Her face, flushed with victory, moments before, had gone stark white with shock and disbelief. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. She who had just orchestrated Amelia's complete social annihilation was now forced to watch as the ultimate prize was laid at her rival's feet. Lord Finch's face was a mask of thunderous fury. His eyes narrowed as he tried to comprehend the Duke's motive. This was a move on the social chessboard, so unexpected, so powerful, it overturned the entire game. Amelia's mind raced. Was this a trick? A new, more elaborate form of humiliation to be led onto the dance floor only to be abandoned, but the look in the Duke's eyes held no malice. There was a gravity there, a seriousness of purpose that felt utterly genuine. He was offering her a lifeline, a public, undeniable shield against her tormentors. Her father's voice again, "Face the world head on." Taking a shaky breath, she placed her small gloved hand into his. His fingers closed around hers, his grip firm and reassuring. A strange warmth spread up her arm, a startling contrast to his cold reputation. "Your Grace," she murmured, finding her voice. "I would be honored." As Alaric led her onto the dance floor, a tidal wave of whispers erupted behind them, crashing against the shores of the room. He ignored it, his focus solely on her. He guided her into the center of the floor, the space clearing before them, as if they were royalty parting the sea. He placed one hand firmly on her waist and took her other, and as the waltz swelled, he swept her into the dance. Amelia was a competent dancer, taught by a patient father in their drawing room long ago, but dancing with the Duke was something else entirely. He moved with an effortless, fluid grace that belied his size. He led with an unspoken confidence, anticipating every turn, every step. She felt weightless, as if she were being carried on the music itself. For the first time all evening, she was not the girl in the tattered gown. She was simply a woman held in the arms of a man who made the rest of the world and its cruel judgments fade into a blurry, insignificant background. They danced in silence for the first few turns, their movements speaking for them. He was shielding her, his tall frame, creating a barrier between her and the prying eyes of the ton. She could feel the stares, of course, but they could no longer touch her. "Are you all right, Miss Vance?" he asked, finally, his voice low for her ears only. "I am now, Your Grace," she answered truthfully. "Thank you, though I confess I am at a loss. I do not understand why you would." She trailed off, unsure how to phrase the question. "Why would you rescue me?" His gaze was intense. "Let us just say that I do not approve of public floggings," he said, his tone clipped, "especially when the victim is undeserving." He glanced over her shoulder, his eyes briefly flicking towards Beatrice and Lord Finch, who stood frozen in a state of impotent rage. A flicker of something hard and dangerous crossed his face before it vanished. "And I have a particular distaste for Lord Finch." The way he said the name with a quiet, venomous disdain sent a shiver through Amelia. "You know him?" she asked. "I know of him," Alaric corrected. "And what I know is enough." He guided her through an elaborate turn, his hand a steady pressure on her back. "Your response to them was admirable. You have your father's courage. Amelia's heart leapt into her throat. You knew my father. A shadow passed over the Duke's features, a deep and ancient sadness. I did, he confirmed. He was a good man, a brilliant man. What happened to him was a travesty. The music began to soften, signaling the end of the waltz. The validation in his words, the simple acknowledgement of her father's worth from a man of such stature, was a balm to Amelia's wounded soul. Tears she had refused to shed in the face of ridicule now threatened to fall in the face of kindness. He was the best man I ever knew, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The final notes of the waltz hung in the air, and they slowed to a stop. The spell was broken. The whispers would begin anew, the questions, the speculation. They were still the center of attention. Instead of releasing her, Alaric kept her hand firmly in his. This ballroom has become rather stifling, he said, his voice once again carrying in the quiet room. Miss Vance, would you allow me to escort you to the terrace? The air is cooler there. It was not a question so much as a declaration. He was not finished. This was not a single chivalrous gesture. It was the next move in his gambit, and he was taking her with him. Without waiting for a response, he led her from the dance floor, past the rows of gawking aristocrats, past a seething Beatrice Cavendish, and towards the French doors that led out into the cool, moonlit night. He had not just saved her from social ruin. He was publicly claiming her, drawing a line in the sand for all of society to see. And Amelia, walking beside him, her hand in his, had a dizzying premonition that her life was about to be irrevocably changed. The moment the French doors closed behind them, the oppressive heat and noise of the ballroom were replaced by the cool, fragrant air of the Harrington Gardens. Moonlight silvered the leaves of the ancient oaks and cast long shadows across the manicured lawns. A nearby fountain trickled its gentle sound, a soothing melody after the cacophony within. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Amelia drew in a deep breath of the clean night air, trying to calm the frantic beating of her heart. She stood by the stone balustrade, looking out over the sleeping garden, acutely aware of the Duke's presence beside her. He was a silent, powerful shape in the darkness, and the silence that stretched between them was no longer the comfortable quiet of the dance, but one heavy with unspoken questions. Your Grace. Amelia began, turning to face him. I must thank you again. What you did in there, you saved me from a humiliation I'm not sure I would have recovered from. But I still do not understand. Why? Alaric moved away from the doors, stepping into a patch of moonlight that illuminated the sharp, handsome lines of his face. His expression was somber, the mask of cold indifference stripped away to reveal a man burdened by something deep and heavy. Miss Vance, Amelia. He said, the use of her first name startling her. My intervention was not born of mere chivalry. It was a matter of a long overdue debt. A debt? She asked, confused. I do not know of any debt between our families. He looked away, his gaze fixed on some distant, unseen point in the darkness. You would not. It is a part of my family's history that I am not proud of. My father, the late Duke, and your father, Thomas Vance, were more than acquaintances. They were partners. Amelia's eyes widened. She knew her father had had a titled partner. It was the man's influence and supposed expertise that had convinced her father to risk everything, but her father, in his shame and grief, had never spoken the man's name. They embarked on a venture together. Alaric continued, his voice low and strained. A fleet of ships knew trade routes. It was your father's vision, but my father's capital that launched it. My father was an impulsive man. He saw the potential for immense profit and pushed your father to invest everything he had. A cold dread began to creep up Amelia's spine. She felt she was on the precipice of a truth she was not ready to hear. The venture failed. Alaric stated the words flat and hard. Every ship was lost. The cargo, the investment, all of it. It was a catastrophic loss. We were told it was a storm off the Cape, Amelia said quietly. A freak act of nature. That was the official story, Alaric said, turning to face her fully. The torment in his grey eyes was stark in the moonlight. It was a lie concocted to cover the truth to save my father from ruinous scandal. There was no storm, Amelia. The venture was sabotaged. Amelia felt the stone of the balustrade press cold against her back as she leaned against it for support. Sabotaged by whom? By the man you met this evening, the Duke answered, his voice turning to ice. Lord Percival Finch. The name struck Amelia with the force of a physical blow. Finch, the man who had just sneered at her father's memory, who had called him a dreamer, who flew too close to the sun. It was all starting to make a horrifying kind of sense. Finch was a rival to both our fathers. Alaric explained, his words coming faster, now the confession pouring out of him. He saw a chance to destroy them both. He fed my father false intelligence about the security of the routes, all while secretly plotting with pirates and corrupt port officials. He ensured the ships would be seized. He orchestrated the entire disaster. But if your father knew this, why did he not expose Finch? Why did he let my father take the fall? The question was an anguished whisper. Alaric's expression was pained. Pride, he said the word tasting like ash. And guilt. Finch was clever. He covered his tracks so well that by the time my father realized the full extent of the betrayal, he had no concrete proof, only his suspicions. To make a public accusation without proof would have exposed his own poor judgment and implicated the Beaumont name in a colossal failure. My father's fortune was large enough to weather the loss. Yours was not. So he chose silence. He concocted the story of the storm and let the world believe your father was simply a poor businessman. The silence on the terrace was profound. The fountain's gentle trickle now sounded like a roar in Amelia's ears. The entire foundation of her life, the story of her family's tragic but blameless downfall, had just crumbled into dust. Her father had not been the victim of fate. He had been the victim of a conspiracy, sacrificed to protect the name of his powerful partner. A surge of bitter anger rose in her. He destroyed him, she said, her voice shaking with a decade of repressed grief and fury. Your father's silence destroyed my father. It wasn't the loss of the money that killed him. It was the shame. He died believing he had failed us. I know, Alaric said, and the agony in his voice was undeniable. My father lived with that guilt every day. It haunted him. On his deathbed, he confessed everything to me. His final words to me were a command: find Vance. Make it right. I have spent the last 5 years searching for you, Amelia. I employed agents, I followed every lead, but your family had simply vanished. Until tonight. He took a step closer, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. What you saw in the ballroom was not a rescue. It was the beginning of an atonement. I saw Finch speaking to you, preening over the destruction he caused, and I could not stand by. The debt I owe you is not one of money. It is a debt of honor. The honor of your father's name, which my family allowed to be tarnished. Amelia stared at him, her mind reeling from the torrent of revelations. The Duke's coldness, his distance from society, it wasn't arrogance. It was the armor of a man carrying a secret, shameful burden. His actions tonight, His sudden shocking defense of her were not a whim. They were the culmination of a 5-year-long quest. The truth was devastating, but in its own terrible way, it was also liberating. Her father was not a failure. He was a victim, and the man standing before her was offering her something she had thought forever lost: justice. The cool night air seemed to crackle with the energy of the Duke's confession. Amelia pushed herself away from the balustrade, her mind a whirlwind of anger, grief, and a bewildering sense of vindication. For years she had defended her father's memory against the whispers of society, armed only with her own unwavering faith in him. Now she had the truth, and it was uglier and more complex than she could have ever imagined. "Why tell me all this now?" she asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. Was this some elaborate ploy, a way to assuage his conscience with a confession before sending her on her way? "Because you deserve the truth," Alaric said simply, his gaze unwavering. "And because I cannot begin to make it right, as my father charged me without you." He took another step closer. "When my father died, I inherited not only his title and estates, but his offices. In his private study, locked away in a safe, I found everything. His personal journals detailing his suspicions about Finch correspondence, and most importantly, your father's original business ledgers and plans, the ones everyone thought were lost with his ships." Amelia's breath hitched. Her father's ledgers were legendary. He had been a meticulous planner, a visionary who saw patterns in trade and shipping that no one else did. They were his life's work. "My father held on to them," Alaric continued, "perhaps as a reminder of his guilt, I do not know. But I have studied them, Amelia. For years, your father's plans were not just sound, they were revolutionary. The routes he chose, the cargo manifests he designed, the network of contacts he was building, it would have changed the face of British commerce. It was never a risky venture. It was a brilliant one. It only failed because of Finch's meticulous criminal sabotage." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I am not offering you charity, Miss Vance. I would not insult you or your father's memory in such a way. I am offering you a partnership." "A partnership," she repeated, the word sounding foreign on her tongue. "Yes. For the past 2 years, I have been using my own resources to quietly acquire ships. I have re-established contact with the foreign port officials your father trusted. I have been gathering evidence against Finch, charting his own shipping business, and identifying the weaknesses he himself created in the market. I have laid the groundwork. But the final piece, the key to it all, is your father's genius, his plans." He looked at her, his grey eyes burning with an intensity she had never seen in another person. "I want to rebuild your father's company, Vance Shipping. We will use his original plans, updated with my new intelligence. We will launch the fleet he dreamed of. And when we are done, we will not only restore your family's fortune, but we will use the evidence I've gathered to expose Finch for the fraud and criminal he is, and utterly destroy him. But I cannot do it alone. It must be a Vance who helms this venture. It must be you." Amelia was speechless. He was offering her a life raft, but it was not just to save her from drowning. He was offering her the chance to captain her own ship. He was not giving her a handout. He was giving her back her legacy. It was an audacious, almost insane proposal. She was a woman with no money, no connections, and no experience in business. As if reading her thoughts, he said, "You are your father's daughter. I saw it tonight. You have his intelligence, his fire, his refusal to be broken. You think I did not know who you were when you spoke to Beatrice? I saw a Vance standing her ground. Everything your father knew, his acumen, His spirit lives on in you. I will handle the capital and the political maneuvering. But I need your insight. I need your name. I need his daughter to see his vision through to completion. It was a staggering, terrifying, and exhilarating prospect. To reclaim her name, to vindicate her father, to bring his betrayer to justice. It was everything she had ever dreamed of, a fantasy she had never dared to entertain. "Why?" she asked again, but this time the question was different. It wasn't about his motives for telling her the truth, but about his faith in her. "Why trust me with so much? Because my family owes your family everything," he said, his voice raw with conviction. "And because when I look at you, I do not see the woman in the tattered gown that everyone else sees. I see the heir to a fallen empire, and I believe you have the strength to rebuild it." He extended his hand, not for a dance this time, but for something far more significant. It hung in the cool night air between them, a bridge between their two shattered pasts and a possible shared future. "Help me right this wrong, Amelia," he urged. "Let us restore the name of Thomas Vance together." Amelia looked at his outstretched hand, then into his eyes. In their icy depths, she saw the reflection of her own desire for justice, her own longing to honor her father. She saw a man who was not cold, but burdened, a man who was offering her not pity, but profound respect. In that moment, she made a choice. She would no longer be a victim of her past. She would become the architect of her future. Her hand, small and trembling, slightly rose to meet his. As her fingers clasped his, a pact was sealed. A debt of honor was about to be repaid, not with coin, but with vengeance and vindication. When they re-entered the ballroom, the change was immediate and palpable. The music was playing and couples were still dancing, but a current of electric tension ran beneath the surface of the polite festivities. Every head turned, as the Duke, with Amelia still on his arm, walked back into the light. If their departure had caused a stir, their return was a cataclysm. They were no longer the coldest Duke and the penniless Vance girl. They were a mystery, a united front that defied all social logic. Amelia could feel the burning stare of Beatrice Cavendish from across the room, a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. Lord Finch, who had been in deep conversation with the Earl of Pembroke, fell silent, his eyes narrowing with suspicion and animosity as he watched them. But Amelia no longer cared. The fear and shame that had clung to her like a shroud all evening had been burned away by the revelations on the terrace. She walked with her head held high, not with the practiced posture of a debutante, but with the newfound confidence of a woman with a purpose. She was no longer a moth. She was a phoenix ready to rise from the ashes of her family's past. Alaric did not lead her to a quiet corner. He did not spirit her away. Instead, he steered them directly towards the center of the room, towards their host, Lord Harrington, a portly, influential man who was holding court near the orchestra. "Harrington," the Duke said, his voice calm but commanding. Lord Harrington turned his jovial face, breaking into a wide smile at the sight of the Duke. "Beaumont, a rare pleasure to see you enjoying yourself," he boomed before his eyes fell on Amelia, his expression turning to one of polite confusion. "I am not merely enjoying myself," Alaric announced, his voice ringing with a clarity that caused the conversations around them to falter and die. "I am conducting business." This statement sent a fresh shockwave through the room. The Duke, who famously loathed mixing business with pleasure, was making an announcement at the most significant social event of the season. "Allow me to introduce my new partner." Alaric continued, turning slightly to present Amelia. "Miss Amelia Vance." He let the name hang in the air for a moment. He could see the flickers of recognition, the whispers of the ruined Vances starting up again. He preempted them. Daughter of the late great Thomas Vance. He declared, his voice imbued with a deep, resonant respect. A man whose visionary work in global shipping is about to be realized. Lord Harrington blinked, completely nonplussed. Vance Thomas Vance. My dear boy, that venture was a disaster born of sabotage, not of incompetence. Alaric corrected his eyes, finding and locking with Lord Finch's across the room. Miss Vance and I will be relaunching her father's company, Vance Shipping, effective immediately. I trust that my friends and the wiser members of the financial community will recognize the immense potential of finally bringing Thomas Vance's brilliant strategies to market under the joint stewardship of a Beaumont and a Vance. It was a masterstroke. In 3 sentences, he had completely rewritten the narrative. Amelia was no longer a pitiable outcast. She was the heir to a brilliant legacy. Her family's failure was not a source of shame, but a tale of sabotage, hinting at a dark conspiracy. And most powerfully, he had tied his own unimpeachable name and fortune to hers. To question Amelia Vance was now to question the judgment of Duke Alaric Beaumont, and no one in that room was foolish enough to do that. The silence was absolute. Beatrice Cavendish's face was a mask of thunderous disbelief. All her petty, cruel work had been undone and overshadowed in an instant. Lord Finch was ashen-faced, the Duke's pointed stare, and the word sabotage, a clear and public declaration of war. He was trapped. To protest or question the Duke's story would only draw suspicion upon himself. Amelia stood tall beside Alaric, her heart pounding, not with fear, but with a fierce, triumphant pride. He had given her back her name. In front of the very people who had scorned it, he had polished it until it shone. Lord Harrington, a shrewd man who knew which way the wind was blowing, recovered first. "Well, I'll be," he exclaimed, beaming at Amelia. "A Vance in business with a Beaumont. My dear young lady, your father was a friend. It is a delight to see his legacy in such capable hands. We must speak about investment opportunities." The dam broke. Suddenly Amelia was surrounded. People who had looked through her an hour ago were now clamoring for an introduction. Fathers of shipping magnates, bankers, investors, they all saw the Duke's endorsement and the promise of profit. She handled the attention with a calm, quiet grace that impressed Alaric immensely. Later, as the evening was winding down, he escorted her to a waiting carriage, not a hired hack, but his own ducal carriage, emblazoned with the Beaumont crest. "This is only the beginning," he said, standing by the carriage door. "Finch will not go down without a fight." "I'm not afraid," Amelia replied, and she meant it. For the first time in a decade, she felt truly fearless. "Thank you, Alaric." The use of his name, so natural and soft, seemed to breach his final defenses. The coldness in his eyes melted away, completely replaced by a warmth that was more dazzling than any chandelier. "The honor is all mine, Amelia," he said softly. As the carriage pulled away, Amelia looked back at the grand facade of Harrington House. She had entered it as a ghost, a relic of a forgotten past. She was leaving as a force to be reckoned with, the co-founder of a new enterprise, her future stretching before her, bright and full of possibility. The tattered gown she wore no longer felt like a symbol of her poverty, but a testament to her survival. And she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul that the dance with the coldest duke was not an ending. It was the beginning of everything. And so a single dance changed everything. It wasn't just about a duke saving a damsel in distress. It was about two souls, both burdened by the past, finding a shared purpose in the pursuit of justice. Amelia's story reminds us that true worth isn't found in the fabric of your gown or the weight of your purse, but in the strength of your character and the courage to fight for the honor of those you love. Their journey to rebuild her father's legacy and expose a powerful enemy had only just begun, promising a future filled with danger, ambition, and a love forged not in a fairy tale ballroom, but in the fires of adversity. What did you think of Amelia's incredible transformation? Do you believe in second chances? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of resilience and romance, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with a friend who loves a good drama. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss the next story. Thank you for listening.